The whole town laughed at Abigail Mercer's biscuits until a starving little boy reached for the one they had thrown in the mud. She stood outside Hollis General Store with flour still dusting the sleeves of her faded blue dress, her round cheeks pink from the oven heat and the cold March wind, one hand resting on the edge of a wooden crate that held the last 6 biscuits she had baked before dawn. They were not pretty biscuits. They rose uneven, some leaning like tired fence posts, some cracked at the top where the butter had pushed through, but they were warm and they smelled of buttermilk, wood smoke, and the kind of kitchen a person remembered long after leaving home. That was the trouble. Cedar Falls had already decided Abigail Mercer did not belong to anything worth remembering. "Well, don't that look like a wagon wheel after a hard winter?" Mrs. Pauline Griggs said, lifting one biscuit between 2 gloved fingers as if it might stain her. The ladies beside her covered their mouths and laughed. A ranch hand near the hitching rail called out, "Careful, ma'am. One bite of that and you'll need a doctor." More laughter rolled down the boardwalk. Abigail did not answer. She had learned that shame fed on replies. She only folded her hands over her apron and kept her eyes on the crate. The rent at Mrs. Dobson's boarding house was due by sundown. 6 biscuits at 2 cents each would not save her, but it would prove she had tried. Mrs. Griggs broke off a corner, touched it to her tongue, and made a face sharp enough to draw another round of laughter. "Dry as prairie dust," she said. "Even pigs would turn from this." Then she let the biscuit fall. It landed in the street mud with a soft ruined sound. Abigail's breath caught, but her back stayed straight. She stepped off the boardwalk, bent slowly and picked it up. Mud clung to the bottom. Her fingers trembled once before she tucked it into her apron pocket, not because it could be sold, but because food ought not be left in the road like trash. That was when the laughter thinned. A tall widowed cowboy had stopped at the edge of the crowd, holding the reins of a bay mare in one hand and the small hand of a boy in the other. Thomas Whitaker was known in Cedar Falls the way Winter was known, quiet, hard, and better not challenged. His wife had been gone nearly a year, and since then the Whitaker ranch had become a place men spoke of softly, as if grief might hear them. Beside him stood his daughter Elsie, 7 years old, pale-haired and silent, clutching a rag doll so worn its face had nearly disappeared. His son Noah, 5, leaned against Thomas's leg with hollow eyes and a stubborn little mouth that had refused most meals for weeks. Abigail saw the boy looking at the crate. Not at the women. Not at the laughing men. At the biscuits. Thomas saw it too. "How much?" he asked. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Abigail swallowed. 2 cents, sir." Mrs. Griggs laughed again, but softer now. "Mr. Whitaker, I wouldn't feed that to your horse." Thomas did not look at her. He reached into his coat, placed a nickel on the crate, and picked up the smallest biscuit, the crooked one with the split golden top. Abigail almost warned him it had cooled. She almost apologized for its shape, for her hands, for standing there too large and too hopeful in a town that liked women small in every possible way. But Thomas Whitaker lifted the biscuit to his mouth and took one bite. The street seemed to hold its breath. He stopped chewing. His jaw tightened. His eyes lowered to the biscuit as if it had spoken a name he had not allowed in his house for 12 long months. Noah tugged his sleeve. Elsie stared at Abigail from behind her doll. No one laughed now. Thomas took another bite, slower this time, and something in his face shifted, not soft exactly, but shaken like a locked door had felt a warm hand on the other side. Abigail looked down, waiting for the joke, the pity, the polite cruelty that always came dressed as kindness. Instead, the widowed cowboy looked straight at her and said, "This is home." For one long second, Abigail Mercer believed Thomas Whitaker had spoken those words as a kindness meant to cover her humiliation, and kindness in public could sting worse than mockery when everyone knew it was only there to make the poor woman look less pitiful. She lowered her eyes to the mud on her hem and reached for the nickel on the crate, but Thomas put his hand over the coin before she could touch it. "Keep the biscuits," he said. "I already paid." "You paid too much." "Then I will take another." The crowd stayed quiet in that hungry way people did when they were waiting for a proud man to embarrass himself. Thomas picked up a second biscuit and broke it in half. He did not offer it to the women who had laughed. He crouched down beside Noah and held out the smaller piece in his open palm. "You do not have to eat it," he said. "Just smell it." Noah looked up at his father, then at Abigail, then at the biscuit. His little fingers moved slowly, as if reaching for food had become a thing that required courage. He took the piece, held it near his mouth and breathed in. Abigail saw the change before anyone else did. The boy's shoulders loosened. His lips parted. He nibbled one corner, so small a bite it barely counted, but Thomas went still as a fence post in frost. Noah chewed. He swallowed. Then, without looking at the crowd, he took another bite. A sound went through the people gathered there. Not quite a gasp and not quite a whisper. Elsie stepped closer to her father's coat but did not speak. She had not spoken in Cedar Falls since her mother was laid in the churchyard, and folks had grown used to talking about her silence as if she were not standing right there hearing every word. Abigail did not stare at the child. She knew what it felt like to be studied for what was missing. Thomas rose to his full height. "Can you cook supper?" he asked. Abigail blinked. "Most days, yes. For children. Children, ranch hands, travelers, sick folks, stubborn folks. I have cooked for all kinds." Noah had finished the biscuit half. Crumbs clung to his chin. Thomas noticed and swallowed hard. "Can you cook for 2 children who forgot how to eat?" Abigail's hand tightened around the edge of her apron. Behind her, Pauline Griggs made a small offended noise, as though the question itself had broken some rule of town judgment. "Mr. Whitaker," Abigail said carefully, "I can fill an empty stomach. A heart that has gone hungry is harder work." Thomas did not look away. "I did not ask if it was easy." That answer touched something in her, though she would not have named it hope, not in the middle of a street that had just watched her bend into the mud. "I would need a stove that draws proper, flour that has not gone damp, and time enough not to be rushed." "I have a stove." "Does it draw proper?" "No." "Then I would need to fix that first." One corner of his mouth moved, not a smile but the memory of one. "You are asking for a great deal from a man who only wanted supper." "No, sir," Abigail said. "I am telling you supper is not made by wishing at cold iron." The silence changed then. It was no longer the silence of a town waiting to laugh. It was the silence of people realizing the woman they had dismissed still had a spine beneath her faded dress. Thomas glanced at the boarding house at the far end of the street, where Abigail's small carpetbag sat on the porch because the landlady had already set it out before breakfast. His eyes returned to her face. "I need a cook at Whitaker Ranch. Not a wife. Not a mother for my children. A cook. You would have a room behind the kitchen, fair wages every Saturday, and no one will trouble you while you are under my roof." Abigail heard every hard edge in the offer. She also heard the boy licking crumbs from his thumb. "And when you decide I do not belong there either?" she asked. Thomas looked toward Noah, then Elsie, then the biscuits cooling in the crate. "Then I will say it plain. I do not hide behind a town to do my speaking." Abigail studied him for a moment. The wind pushed flour dust from her sleeve into the air between them. "I can cook supper," she said, "but I will not be laughed out of another kitchen." Thomas picked up her carpetbag before she could tell him not to. "Then come prove them wrong." Whitaker Ranch sat 7 miles beyond Cedar Falls, where the road thinned into 2 wagon tracks, and the cottonwoods leaned hard against the wind. Abigail rode on the wagon seat beside Thomas with her carpetbag at her feet, the empty biscuit crate behind them, and the 2 children tucked under a wool blanket in the back. Noah fell asleep before the town disappeared from sight, one hand curled around the last biscuit as though someone might take it from him. Elsie stayed awake. She watched Abigail without blinking, her rag doll pressed beneath her chin, her silence filling the wagon more heavily than any words could have. Thomas did not make conversation. He guided the team through the ruts, his shoulders square, his hat low, his jaw set the way a man set a fence post and meant it to hold. Abigail was grateful for the quiet at first. Then the quiet became a room she had not been invited to enter. By the time the ranch house came into view, the sun had dropped behind the low hills, turning the windows copper and the barn roof black. It should have looked welcoming. It did not. The house stood clean and strong, but there was no smoke lifting from the chimney, no lamp glowing in the kitchen window, no dog barking from the porch. It looked less like a home than a place that had been holding its breath for too long. Thomas stopped the wagon near the back steps. "Kitchen door sticks," he said. "Push with your shoulder." Abigail climbed down before he could offer a hand, Not because she thought he would be unkind, but because she had learned to stand before anyone could decide whether she was worth helping. The back door groaned open, and cold air met her from inside the house. The kitchen smelled of ashes, old coffee, and flour gone damp in the sack. A cast iron stove crouched in the corner, black and neglected. The table was bare except for a tin cup, a dull knife, and a small wooden horse with one broken leg. Dust lay in the corners. A woman's blue shawl hung on a peg near the window, untouched by weather and time, as if the one who owned it might come back for it before supper. Abigail saw it and looked away. Some things in a grieving house were not objects. They were wounds with hooks. Thomas carried Noah inside and set him on a bench near the stove. Elsie came in last and stopped beside the doorway, her doll hanging from one hand. Thomas placed Abigail's carpetbag by a narrow door behind the pantry shelves. "Your room is there. It is small, but it has a bed and a latch." "That is more than I had this morning," Abigail said. He looked at her then, briefly, as if the answer had struck him in a place he did not care to show. Then his face closed again. "You cook. You sleep there. You take your pay on Saturday. You do not touch my wife's things." His eyes moved once toward the blue shawl. "You do not sit in her chair by the front window. You do not go into the children's room unless I say so. And you do not touch my children unless they ask you first." Abigail held his gaze. The rules were cold, but they were honest. She preferred honest cold to warm deceit. "I do not touch what does not reach for me," she said. Thomas blinked once. Noah stirred on the bench, still asleep, the biscuit clutched to his chest. Elsie's eyes moved from her father to Abigail, then to the stove. "There is salt in the cupboard," Thomas said. "Coffee in the tin. Flour in the sack, if it has not soured." "It has," Abigail said. "I can smell it from here." He frowned. "You have not opened it." "I do not need to open a window to know when rain is coming." For the second time that day, the corner of his mouth almost remembered how to smile. Almost. "Can you make supper or not?" Abigail untied her bonnet and set it on her carpetbag. Then she rolled up her sleeves, revealing strong pale forearms dusted with flour from the morning and reddened by the cold. "I can make something out of poor flour, old coffee, and stubborn silence," she said. "But I will need firewood, clean water, and that stovepipe cleared before it smokes us all blind." Thomas stood still for a moment, as if no one had given orders in that kitchen since his wife died. Then he took his hat from his head and hung it on the peg farthest from the blue shawl. "I will get the wood." Abigail waited until he stepped outside before she crossed to the stove. She laid one hand against the cold iron. Not lovingly, not fearfully, just firmly, the way a person might greet a sleeping thing until it morning had come. Behind her, Elsie moved without a sound. The little girl placed her worn rag doll on the kitchen table, directly beside the broken wooden horse, and then backed away. Abigail did not turn too quickly. She only looked at the doll, then at Elsie, and spoke softly to the room. "All right then. I suppose we are making supper for 4. Abigail found enough clean flour at the bottom of a sealed crock. Not much, maybe 3 cups once she sifted out the hard clumps, but enough for supper if a woman knew how to stretch mercy thin. Thomas came back with an armload of split oak and set it beside the stove without speaking. He had soot on one sleeve from clearing the pipe and a line of cold across his cheek where the wind had touched him. Abigail thanked him, and he answered with a nod, then moved to the far side of the kitchen as if he meant to stand guard over his own house until he understood what she was doing to it. She did not mind. A grieving man watching a stranger in his kitchen was no different from a skittish horse watching a new hand at the gate. "You moved slow. You made no sudden claims. You let the work speak first." She rinsed the table, wiped the knife, trimmed the sour edge from the milk, and cut cold fat into flour with 2 plain forks because the pastry cutter was rusted in a drawer. Noah sat on the bench with his knees pulled up, eyes heavy but open now, following every motion. Abigail pretended not to notice. Children who had been worried over too long could feel a tension like a hand pushing between their shoulders. She made the biscuits smaller than usual, no wider than a silver dollar, soft in the center, brushed with the last spoonful of honey she found in a jar behind the coffee tin. For Thomas she warmed beans with onion and a little salt. For Elsie she set a cup of milk near the edge of the table, close enough to reach, far enough not to demand. The kitchen changed by inches. Firelight touched the stove. Steam rose from the pot. The smell of baking bread pushed the stale air toward the door and filled the corners with something almost brave. When the first tray came out, Noah sat straighter. Abigail lifted one small biscuit with a towel and placed it on a chipped saucer. She did not hand it to him. She set it on the bench near his knee and turned back to the stove. "That one is not for brave boys," she said softly. "It is only for hungry ones." Noah stared at it. Thomas looked at his son but did not move. The silence in that kitchen became so delicate Abigail could hear the butter settle under the crust. Noah reached out. He touched the biscuit with one finger, then pulled back as if expecting someone to tell him he had done it wrong. No one did. He picked it up, broke off a crumb and put it on his tongue. His face did not brighten all at once. Healing did not work like a lamp being lit. It came more like dawn, slow and pale, almost missed unless someone had been waiting in the dark. He took another bite, then another. Abigail kept her back turned because she had the sudden foolish fear that looking straight at him might frighten the hunger away. Thomas gripped the back of a chair. The wood creaked under his hand. Noah finished the biscuit and looked at the tray. His voice came out rough from disuse and shyness. "Can I have one for Elsie?" Thomas closed his eyes for half a breath. Abigail took a second biscuit, set it on the saucer, and slid it toward him. "You may carry it to her if she wants it." Noah climbed down, careful as an old man, and crossed the kitchen to where Elsie stood beside the pantry door with her doll tucked under her arm. He held up the biscuit. "It is soft," he whispered. Elsie looked at him, then at Abigail, then at her father. She did not speak, but she took it. She sat on the bottom step by the kitchen door and ate in tiny pieces, one hand cupped beneath her chin to catch the crumbs. Thomas turned away toward the window, but not before Abigail saw his mouth tighten and his shoulders dip, like a man setting down a weight he had carried past all reason. Supper was served on mismatched plates. Noah ate half a bowl of beans and 2 more little biscuits. Elsie drank the milk. Thomas ate in silence, but every few minutes his eyes returned to the children as if he did not quite trust what he was seeing. When Abigail reached to clear the table, Noah caught the edge of her apron between 2 fingers. He did not hold tight. He only held enough to ask without asking. Abigail stopped. Thomas saw it. The room went still again. She looked down at the boy and waited. Noah swallowed. "Will there be breakfast?" Abigail's hand rested gently on the table beside him, close but not touching. "There will be breakfast," she said. "If your father has eggs." Thomas answered before she could look at him. "I will have eggs." Morning came gray and thin over Whitaker Ranch, with frost silvering the pasture fence and a rooster complaining behind the barn as if the whole world had risen too early. Abigail was already in the kitchen before sunup, sleeves rolled, hair pinned, hands moving through flour with a steadiness she did not feel. The night had given her a bed, a latch and 4 walls, yet sleep had only touched her in pieces. She kept hearing Noah ask if there would be breakfast. She kept seeing Thomas turn toward the window with his face pulled tight. She kept seeing Elsie take the biscuit without a word, as if silence itself had learned how to eat. There were eggs, just as Thomas had promised. A dozen brown ones sat in a basket by the door, still cold from the henhouse. Beside them was a small sack of fresh flour, a crock of butter, and a folded note in Thomas's square handwriting. "Bought from Miller before dawn. Put it on my account." Abigail stood over that note longer than she meant to. Then she set it aside and went to work. By 6 o'clock, the stove had heat in its belly, coffee breathed in the pot, and biscuits rose golden in the oven, taller this time, tender at the sides. She was brushing the tops with melted butter when Thomas stepped in, hat in hand, and stopped near the threshold. "You are up early," he said. "Breakfast does not make itself." His eyes moved over the table, the clean counter, the biscuit dough, the children's cups waiting in a neat row. "Neither does a kitchen," he said. Abigail did not answer. Praise was harder to hold than insult when a person had gone too long without it. She reached for the tray, but the towel slipped, and her fingers touched the hot edge. She drew back fast with a small breath. Thomas crossed the room before she could hide her hand. "Let me see." "It is nothing." "I did not ask what it was." She looked at him then and he stopped reaching. His own rules stood between them. Do not touch unless asked. Abigail saw him remember it. Something in her chest loosened against her will. She turned her palm up. The burn was small, no worse than a kitchen could give any cook, but Thomas's eyes did not stay on the burn. They moved to the older marks across her fingers, the rough patches near her knuckles, the faint red lines where heat and work had written their history. You have been baking longer than yesterday, he said. Since I was tall enough to see over a flour barrel. She took her hand back gently. My mother baked for miners, soldiers, freight men, anyone with a coin and an empty stomach. She used to say a biscuit could tell a lonely man he had not been forgotten. Thomas looked toward the oven. Is that her recipe? Abigail hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a folded paper, soft at the creases and browned along the edges. On one side was a recipe written in a woman's careful hand. On the other was half a letter, the ink faded by years of being opened and closed. Thomas did not ask to take it. He only looked. She wrote it before she passed, Abigail said. I carried it from Missouri to Kansas, then here. I thought if I could sell enough biscuits I could open a proper bakery. A little stove, 2 tables, maybe a blue sign out front. Her mouth curved, but it was not a smile. Cedar Falls did not care for blue signs. Thomas leaned against the counter, quiet as falling ash. What happened? Abigail folded the recipe once, then again. A man named Edwin Pike owns the bakery in town. He told folks I use spoiled flour. Then he told the church ladies I begged at back doors. Then somehow my orders disappeared before they were delivered, and my name became a joke before my biscuits ever reached a plate. She slipped the paper back into her apron. It is an easy thing to ruin a woman who has no witness. Thomas's jaw worked once. Pike was there yesterday. He was the one laughing near the hitching rail. The stove ticked in the quiet. Outside, Noah's voice rose in the yard, asking if breakfast was ready, and the sound seemed to pull warmth straight through the walls. Abigail turned back to the tray. I do not need trouble, Mr. Whitaker. I only need work. Thomas picked up the note he had left by the eggs, folded it, and placed it beside her mother's recipe on the counter, not touching either one, but setting his promise close to hers. Then you will have work, he said. And this time you will have a witness. By the end of Abigail Mercer's first week at Whitaker Ranch, the kitchen no longer sounded like an empty room pretending to be useful. It had become the first place awake and the last place to sleep. Before sunrise, the stove cracked and sighed as oak caught fire in its belly. Coffee darkened in the pot. Flour drifted across the table like pale snow. Biscuits rose in neat golden rows, and the windows, once gray with dust, began to glow before the rest of the house knew morning had come. Thomas did not say the ranch had changed. He was not a man built for saying what frightened him, but he started coming in through the kitchen door instead of the front. He started leaving fresh eggs on the counter without a note. He fixed the broken leg on Noah's wooden horse and set it beside Abigail's mixing bowl as if it had always belonged there. The ranch hands notice first because hungry men notice food before they noticed miracles. On Monday they ate breakfast standing, hats in hand, uncertain whether they were allowed to enjoy anything in a house that had worn mourning so long. On Tuesday, old Caleb Price asked for a second biscuit and looked ashamed of himself for wanting it. On Wednesday, 3 men came early and washed at the pump without being told because Abigail had said no man sat at her table with fenced dirt on his hands. Thomas heard that from the barn and waited for someone to laugh. No one did. They washed. Noah changed faster than any of them. His cheeks gained color. He began carrying kindling. In both arms, proud of the small weight. He asked for honey by name. Once, when a biscuit split open and steam curled up from the center, he laughed. It was not loud, not even full, but it was real enough to make Thomas stop in the doorway with one glove half pulled off. Elsie remained quiet, but her silence moved closer. At first she watched from the stairs, then from the pantry door, then from beneath the kitchen table, where she sat with her rag doll and listened while Abigail told stories to the doe. Not to Elsie, never directly. Abigail told the doe about a mule in Missouri that refused to cross a bridge unless someone sang to it. She told the doe about a blue sign she still meant to have one day. She told the doe that some things rose better when left alone in warmth. Elsie listened with her chin on her knees. One evening, rain came hard over the pasture and turned the yard to shining black mud. Thomas rode in late, soaked through, his coat heavy and his hat dripping onto the back steps. He opened the kitchen door and stopped. The lamp was low. The stove held a steady red glow. Noah slept on the bench with a quilt tucked around him. Abigail sat in the rocker near the stove, not the front window chair, never that chair, with Elsie curled against her side, sound asleep, one small hand caught in Abigail's apron. The rag doll lay in Abigail's lap. Abigail had one arm around the child, loose enough to let go, careful enough to keep her warm. Thomas stood in the doorway as rain tapped behind him. His face changed so little most folks would have missed it, but Abigail saw the breath leave him. "She has not slept without crying in almost a year," he said. Abigail looked down at Elsie's pale head. "Then do not wake her." Thomas did not move. Water dripped from his sleeve to the floorboards. "I told you not to touch my children unless they asked." She did not use words. Elsie stirred but did not wake. Her fingers tightened in the apron. Thomas looked at that small hand, then at Abigail's steady one. "I reckon she asked plain enough." The words settled between them, warmer than the stove and more dangerous. Abigail felt it, and looked away first. "Your supper is in the pot." "I am not hungry." "That has not stopped you from needing food before." He almost smiled. This time it came closer than a memory. He crossed the room quietly, removed his wet coat, and hung it far from the blue shawl that still waited on its peg. Then he sat at the table and ate the stew she had left for him. He ate slowly, watching the sleeping children as if afraid the sight might vanish if he looked too hard. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the dust from the yard, the porch, the barn roof. Inside, the kitchen breathed. For the first time since his wife's passing, Thomas Whitaker heard his house make ordinary sounds again. A child dreaming, a spoon against a bowl, a woman humming under her breath while the fire held. And though he did not say it, the truth stood in the room with all of them. This was not a family. Not yet. But it had begun to resemble one closely enough to scare him. The trouble came on Saturday morning wearing clean gloves and church smiles. Abigail had just set a pan of biscuits on the window ledge to cool when Mrs. Pauline Griggs arrived in a buggy with two other ladies from Cedar Falls, their bonnets tied tight under their chins and their eyes moving over the Whitaker kitchen as if they had paid admission to inspect it. Thomas was in the north pasture checking a washed-out fence, and the ranch hands had gone with him, leaving only Abigail, Noah, and Elsie in the house. Pauline stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "Well," she said, looking at the scrub table, the warm stove, the folded towels, and Noah sitting with a biscuit in each hand. "You have made yourself comfortable." Abigail wiped flour from her fingers. "Can I help you, Mrs. Griggs?" "The ladies' aid is holding its spring supper this afternoon. There will be a baking table. Every respectable kitchen in the county is sending something." Her smile sharpened. "Since folks are saying your biscuits have somehow become famous at Whitaker Ranch, we thought it only fair to let the town taste them properly." Abigail heard the trap before she saw its shape. "I have work here." "Of course. But Mr. Whitaker's children are welcome to come. It would be good for little Elsie to be among people again." At the sound of her name, Elsie stepped closer to the pantry door, her doll pressed flat against her chest. Pauline glanced at her and lowered her voice in a way that made every word more cruel for pretending to be gentle. "A child ought not spend all her days in a kitchen with hired help." Noah slid off his chair and stood beside Abigail. "She makes breakfast," he said. Pauline blinked, surprised to hear him speak. "I am sure she does." "And supper," Noah added. "And soft biscuits." Abigail placed one hand on the back of his chair, not touching him but steadying herself. "I will send a basket," she said. "No need for a table." "Oh, but there is a need," Pauline said. "A woman's work should stand in the light if she is proud of it." By noon, Abigail was in the churchyard of Cedar Falls with a covered basket on her arm, Noah holding her skirt, and Elsie walking on Thomas's other side. Thomas had returned from the pasture to find the invitation waiting like a snake on his kitchen table. He had not forbidden Abigail to go. He had only said, "You do not owe them a thing." And Abigail had answered, "No, but I owe myself the chance not to run." The church lawn was strung with bunting. Long tables held pies, cakes, pickles, preserves, and 3 neat trays from Edwin Pike's bakery, each marked with a white card in careful ink. Edwin stood behind his table in a striped apron, smiling as if the day itself belonged to him. When Abigail set her basket down, the whispers started. Big woman. Whitaker's cook. The biscuit girl. Thomas heard them. His hand tightened around his hat, but Abigail shook her head once. Not yet. The judging began after the bell. Abigail had brought 2 batches, 1 full tray for the table and a smaller cloth-wrapped bundle tucked low in the basket, made with honey for Noah because crowd stole his appetite. She set the full tray where the ladies told her. Then Mrs. Griggs called her away to help carry coffee. It took less than 2 minutes. When Abigail returned, her biscuits on the judging plate were dark, flat, and hard at the edges. They were not hers. Edwin Pike would not look at her. Pauline lifted one with a napkin and tapped it against the plate. My, she said brightly. Perhaps the Whitaker stove is more forgiving than ours. Laughter moved across the lawn, quick and familiar. Abigail felt heat climb her throat. She looked at the ruined tray, then at the faces waiting for her to shrink. For a moment the whole town became the street again, the mud again, the sound of food being dropped as if it had no worth because she had made it. I think we should go, she said quietly. Noah's small hand caught her skirt. Thomas stepped forward, but before he spoke, Elsie tugged his sleeve. She did not look at the table. She pointed to Abigail's basket, to the cloth bundle still hidden beneath a folded towel. Her hand trembled, but she kept pointing. Thomas followed her gaze. So did Noah. So did Abigail. The ruined biscuits sat in front of the town like a lie dressed for Sunday. But the truth was still warm in the bottom of the basket, waiting to be uncovered. Thomas Whitaker did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sound of his boots crossing the church lawn cut through the laughter cleaner than any shout could have. Abigail reached for the basket, but Thomas was already there, one hand resting on the handle, his eyes on the dark, flattened biscuits that had been placed before the judges. Those are not hers, he said. Pauline Griggs gave a small laugh that sounded brittle at the edges. Mr. Whitaker, I am sure Miss Mercer is disappointed, but blaming others will not improve poor baking. Edwin Pike folded his arms behind his bakery table. A fair contest is a fair contest. Thomas looked at him then. Just looked. Edwin's smile thinned. Open the basket, Abby, Thomas said. The use of her name, gentle and certain, steadied something in her knees. Abigail lifted the folded towel from the bottom of the basket. Warmth breathed out into the spring air. There they were, small honey biscuits, golden and tender, wrapped in clean cloth, made for a frightened little boy who ate better when the world was quiet. The scent moved across the table before anyone could stop it. Butter. Buttermilk. Honey. Wood smoke. Home though. No one said the word yet. Noah stepped forward at once. Those are hers, he said. His voice was small, but it carried. She made them before we left. Pauline's face tightened. Children can be mistaken. I am not mistaken, Noah said, and his hand found Abigail's skirt again. I watched. Thomas picked up one biscuit from the cloth. He turned it in his hand once, as if showing the whole town its shape, its color, its honest little crack across the top. Then he took a bite. No one moved. The church bell rope tapped softly against the white siding in the wind. Thomas chewed slowly, swallowed, and looked out over the faces that had gathered to watch a woman be made small. My son eats because of this woman, he said. A whisper started and died. He lifted the biscuit slightly. He had gone weeks turning away from nearly every plate put before him. She did not force him. She did not shame him. She put food near him and gave him room to be hungry again. Abigail looked down, but Noah leaned against her side, warm and real. Thomas's voice stayed low. My daughter sleeps because of her. Elsie stood half hidden behind his coat, her doll pressed to her chest, eyes wide as the whole churchyard turned toward her. Thomas did not push her forward. He only placed his free hand open at his side, a place she could reach if she wanted. This kitchen at my ranch was cold before she came. My children were quiet in ways no child ought to be quiet. My table had food on it but no comfort. There is a difference, and every decent soul here knows it. Edwin Pike's face reddened. Now see here, Whitaker, this is only a baking table. No, Thomas said. It was a trap. The word landed hard. Pauline looked away first. One of the other church ladies reached for the ruined plate, then stopped, as if touching it might mark her hand with the truth. Thomas set the bitten biscuit back on the cloth and faced the crowd fully. You mocked her food because you never tasted her heart. You laughed before you knew. You judged before you were fed. And when that was not enough, someone put a lie on a plate and called it proof. The silence deepened until Abigail could hear her own breath. Then Elsie moved. She stepped from behind Thomas, crossed the grass, and took one of the honey biscuits in both hands. Abigail's chest tightened. Elsie, Thomas whispered, not warning, only wondering. The little girl lifted the biscuit to her mouth and bit into it. She chewed carefully. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She looked at Abigail, then at the whole town that had spent a year speaking around her silence. When her voice came, it was soft and rough from being unused, but clear enough to stop the wind inside Abigail's heart. It tastes like Mama, Elsie said, then held the biscuit against her chest. But warm. No one breathed. Thomas's face changed as if the earth had shifted beneath him and somehow held. Abigail covered her mouth with one flower-rough hand. Noah smiled up at his sister like the sun had come out just for him. Thomas knelt beside Elsie, not touching until she leaned into him, and only then did he gather her close. Over her head, his eyes found Abigail's. Something passed between them that was not yet a promise, but stood very near one. Then Thomas rose, holding Elsie's hand. Abigail Mercer stays at Whitaker Ranch, he said. She stays in my kitchen, at my table, and under my protection. Anyone who has business with her will bring it to me first. Anyone who mocks her in front of my children will answer to the father whose home she helped bring back. Edwin Pike lowered his gaze. Pauline Griggs said nothing. The judges said nothing. The town that had laughed at Abigail in the street stood quiet beneath the bunting and spring sky, while a little girl took another bite of a biscuit and did not let go of Abby's hand. Spring softened into summer, and Whitaker Ranch learned to sound alive without apologizing for it. The north pasture turned green first, then the cottonwoods filled with leaves, and every morning the kitchen windows shone gold before the sun cleared the barn roof. Abigail rose early because she always had, but now she no longer woke as if she needed to prove she deserved the floor beneath her feet. Her room behind the pantry stayed small, yet Thomas repaired the loose board by the bed, hung a shelf for her mother's recipe, and placed a blue scrap of painted wood above the door without saying where he had found the color. Noah grew rounder in the cheeks and quicker in the legs. He carried eggs 2 at a time from the henhouse, serious as a banker, and announced each cracked shell as if it were a tragedy that required biscuits to heal it. Elsie spoke more slowly. Not all at once, not for the town, not on command, but in little morning pieces. More milk, please. Where is my doll? Abby, the dough is rising. The first time she said Abigail's name, Thomas walked out to the pump and stayed there so long Noah asked if Papa had forgotten how doors worked. The chair by the front window remained empty for another month. Abigail never touched the blue shawl on the peg, and Thomas never asked her to. Grief was not a room that needed sweeping clean. It was a lamp left burning for someone loved, and Abigail understood that a new fire did not dishonor the old one. Then, on the first cool morning of September, Elsie carried the shawl into the kitchen herself. She stood beside Abigail while the biscuit dough rested beneath a towel. Papa says it was Mama's, Elsie said. Abigail dried her hands. Yes. It smells like the cedar chest. That is a good smell. Elsie nodded, then held it out. Can it stay here? Not on the peg. Here. She pointed to the back of Abigail's rocker near the stove. Abigail looked toward Thomas, who stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame. His face was quiet, but his eyes were wet in a way the morning light did not explain away. He nodded once. Abigail took the shawl as carefully as she would take a sleeping child and laid it across the rocker. No one spoke for a long while. The stove ticked. The dough rose. Noah came in asking if Biscuits could be late on account of him being already hungry. Elsie laughed, clear and sudden, and the sound filled the kitchen so completely that Thomas had to lower his head. That afternoon, he built a brick oven behind the house with help from the ranch hands. Abigail told him he was making it too large. Thomas said a proper baker needed room. She said she was only his cook. He set another brick, looked at her over the wet mortar and said, "No, Abby. You are the reason this house remembers how to be a home." She turned away before he could see how those words settled in her face, but he saw enough. By winter, a small blue sign hung near the back road, hand-painted by Thomas, with Noah's thumbprint in one corner and Elsie's careful letters beneath it. Abby's kitchen at Whitaker Ranch. Folks from Cedar Falls began to come for bread, biscuits, and pies, some awkward, some ashamed, some pretending they had always known her worth. Abigail served them kindly, but she no longer bent herself smaller to fit their comfort. Edwin Pike came once, hat in hand, and bought a dozen biscuits without meeting her eyes. Pauline Griggs sent a note with $2 and no advice. Abigail put the money in the church charity box and burned the note in the stove. On Christmas Eve, snow fell soft as flour over the yard. The ranch hands had gone, the horses were fed, and the house glowed from every window. Abigail set a basket of biscuits on the table, while Noah poured milk with both hands and Elsie arranged the napkins beside the plates. Thomas came in last, carrying a small wooden sign, freshly carved and sanded smooth. He set it above the kitchen doorway. Abigail read it once, then pressed her floury fingers to her mouth. It did not say cookroom. It did not say pantry. It said our kitchen. Elsie slipped her hand into Abigail's. "Mama," she said softly, as if trying the word in the warmest part of the room, "are the biscuits ready?" Abigail could not answer right away. Thomas